I grew up in northwestern Nevada along the California border in the foothills of the Sierras. My father was a geologist who preferred working and camping in areas that were as sparsely populated as possible. Between 1970 and 1983, I had a number of encounters in Nevada, California, and Washington states. I plan to submit them individually in chronological sequence so that I can provide as much detail for researchers as possible. The first encounter occurred in 1970 on Peavine Mountain, northwest of Reno, Nevada. I was 10 at the time and tagging along with my father, who was hunting deer. We were on the western side of the mountain, close to the California border. We were between two ridges crossing a meadow on the western face of the east ridge. It was about 3 p.m. and the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees of the western ridge. There were no clouds and it was still very bright in the meadow, but the shallow draw between the two ridges was heavily shadowed. As my father and I neared the center of the meadow, we heard an extended call coming from the west. We lived in Kansas until I was 8, and the call reminded me of the World War II air raid siren they used for tornado alerts where we used to live. It began low and relatively quiet, and rose in both pitch and volume as it progressed. It lasted for about 15 to 20 seconds before rapidly dropping off. After about 10 seconds, the call was repeated. It seemed to me that it was coming from the draw a couple of 100 yards west and downhill from us. Unlike the tornado siren I was familiar with, it had a mellow rather than harsh or mechanical quality to it. As the second call ended, I asked my father what was making the noise. Annoyed, he told me that it was just the siren from a fire tower and picked up his pace. That seemed reasonable, and I began looking around at the surrounding high ground for the tower when the call sounded a third time. It seemed to be coming from the draw, and it seemed to be moving away from us. I caught up with my father and, being a curious 10-year-old, asked him in rapid succession where the tower was and if he smelled any smoke. He replied that it was on the other side of the far ridge and that they were just testing the siren. I told him I thought the call was coming from the draw, and at that point was told to shut up. As the call sounded a fourth time, even further away, my father listened to it and decided to call it a day. We walked to the Jeep and drove home without further incident.
The second encounter occurred in August of 1972 in Lemon Valley, Nevada. Lemon Valley is northwest of Reno on US 395. Though the area I'm about to describe is covered with housing developments, in 1972 there were only 2 developed areas in the valley. Stead Air Force Base was on the west side of the valley and the community of Lemon Valley was on the east side. The community of Lemon Valley was in reality simply a strip of built-up properties along Lemon Valley Road. Just housing and few small businesses extending for about 5 miles towards the back of the valley and for a couple of 100 yards at most to either side of the road. US 395 cut across the south and higher end of the valley at the base of Peavine Mountain's north slope. Toward the back of the valley, the north or lower end, were a few small ranches. Only a couple of improved dirt roads cut across the center of the valley, connecting the community of Lemon Valley to Stead. The climate was high desert, roughly 5,000 feet in elevation with negligible year-round rainfall, but sometimes several feet of snow in the winter. The humidity was generally less than 10% and often as low as 5%. Other than those planted near developed properties, there were no trees in the floor of the valley. Scrub pine begins on the higher ridges about 5 miles west of the valley and thickens to fully developed arid pine forest as the elevation increases. The dominant vegetation is sagebrush, mixed with a wide variety of large weeds and coarse grasses. Jackrabbits, prairie dogs, and smaller rodents were very common, as were a variety of lizards and snakes. Cougar and black bear are rare, but sometimes sighted in the area. Deer stick to the surrounding higher elevations with more trees. Other indigenous animals include hawks, falcons, and a few burrowing owls. Quail and other ground-nesting birds are also plentiful. There is also a variety of large insect species to round out the ecosystem. At first glance, the area may not look like it supports much in the way of life, but it actually does. Snowmelt is the primary source of open water in the late spring and early summer, and a small lake forms towards the back of the valley. By late August, this is usually dried up and the only sources of water are near human habitation. As I mentioned in my first report, the north face of Peavine Mountain was deforested in the late 1800s. It has also eroded significantly over the last century as a natural result of vegetation loss and hydraulic mining. The runoff from the mountain was clearly heavy at some time in the past, because two deep washes cut through half the length of the valley flowing north from Peavine Mountain. These washes were 8 to 10 feet deep in places with vertical walls and averaged 5 to 8 feet in width. Walking down one was much like walking through a school hallway with slight curves. Their depth would increase and decrease as they intersected the natural fingers and draws running down from the ridges that bounded the valley. They were difficult to climb in and out of, except at a few places where they shallowed out to a couple of feet as they intersected a draw. Because they were shaded and contained a little more moisture than the surrounding terrain, they found a small microclimate where certain species of lizard and an occasional scorpion could be found. The sagebrush also grew a little bit taller, about 3 feet along their edges. Below, the floor of the washes were almost perfectly level, shaded and protected from the wind. Very little vegetation grew on the floors of the washes and was usually limited to tumbleweeds and some patches of coarse grass. You could only tell where they were from a stripe of sagebrush running along their edges that was a little greener, thicker, and taller than the rest of the sagebrush in the valley. You couldn't see them or see down into them until you were right on top of them. This encounter took place in the early afternoon in mid-August of 1972. It was bright, sunny, and hot, about 85 degrees Fahrenheit at the time. The wind was less than 5 miles per hour. I was 12. I was with my brother who was 10, and a friend David who was also 12. For years, my brother and I had spent the summers exploring the surrounding hills and valleys. We knew all the best places to catch each type of lizard, the best place to look for arrowheads, where the trash dumps from the 1800s were, and the best places to find old shell casings and such from when the airbase had been active. We didn't often make it out as far as the dry washes, but when we did, we made a point of exploring them because of the unique things like scorpions you could find in them. We had just moved from Stead to the Lemon Valley side of the valley, and David, a new neighbor, was with us for the first, and, as it turned out, only time. We had decided to go all the way out to the closest wash to show it to David, and were angling toward one of the shallow points where it would be easier to get into. As we walked along, we were searching the ground for horned toads, arrowheads, and anything else that might be interesting. We were about 20 feet from the wash when we stumbled across an area with jasper and obsidian chips on the ground, and started looking around in earnest for arrowheads and other stone tools. My brother and I were seriously competitive when it came to hunting arrowheads. I was facing north, focusing on a piece of jasper I had just found, and had my back to my brother and David when I got a sudden feeling something was wrong. I don't know whether I heard one of them gasp or just go abruptly quiet, but I knew there was a problem. I had a sense of where my brother was a few feet behind me and turned to look at him. As I turned clockwise from north to south, I first saw David, about 25 feet away from me and a couple of feet from the rim of the wash. Then what I perceived to be a giant man about 8 feet from David and about 3 feet away from the wash. And finally my brother, who was only about 5 feet behind me. The giant man was about 35 feet from me, standing still, facing me with his arms at his sides looking directly at me. David was in shock, rooted to the ground, staring directly at him with his mouth wide open and his lower jaw level with his collarbones. My brother was poised to run and looking from the man to me, and then to David in a panic. As soon as I saw the man, I took a step to run, but realized David wasn't going anywhere and we need to help him if the man tried to do anything. I settled my weight and looked the man in the eye, waiting for him to indicate his intentions. This all took about a second. At this point, my brother turned to me and screamed,
"That's not a man!"
Not breaking eye contact with a man, I snapped back at him. "Yes, it is!" My brother immediately yelled,
"No, it's not!"
And I snapped right back, "Then what is it?" which shut him up. At that moment, in that situation, it was critically important to me that the man would be nothing more than just a man. I also knew my brother and I could probably get away, but David was at risk, and I intuitively sensed that it was important to control the fear, both by keeping the man just a man, and by calming my brother. As I focused on the man, I recognized that he was not overtly threatening, but seemed stern and annoyed. He didn't move a muscle and he didn't make a sound. From his manner, I gathered that he was not threatening us, but was determining if we were a threat to him. that we had disturbed him and he had just wanted us to go away and leave him alone. My brother and I would have been happy to oblige, but David was still standing like a statue, and we weren't leaving him behind, so we all just stood there and stared at each other. I could see the man from the lower shins on up, and this is where it gets a little strange. He was at least 8.5 feet tall, 3.5 feet to 4 feet broad at the shoulder, and had a comparatively narrow waist. His arms hung down to the top of his knees. Not only was this man huge and slightly disproportionate, but in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of August, to my perception, he was wearing a black down ski parka with the peaked hood up, matching black down ski pants and black gloves. Down ski wear was a brand new fad with the skiers that came through Reno back then. I thought to myself that it was strange that he had this brand new ski outfit, let alone one that fit his frame. I thought he must have stolen it. I had subconsciously assumed this guy was a hobo because we were at least a mile from the nearest road. There wasn't a vehicle in sight, and I couldn't think of a good reason for him to apparently been hiding in the wash. As I thought about it, the hobo assumption made sense. The ski suit was probably the only thing he had to wear, and at night, sleeping out in the open in the high desert tended to get a little chilly, August or not. There was even a little dirt on it in places, indicating he'd been lying on the ground in it. The man's bearing, though, didn't come across the way a homeless person's would. He stood tall with his shoulders relaxed but back. His posture indicated a sense of self-worth that was almost regal, and his gaze didn't flinch. Even under the ski suit, you could tell that he had a massively muscled upper body, and the ratio to shoulders to waist were those of a world-class athlete. For a moment, I thought I was looking at fur-covered muscle, and immediately killed the thought, then started to look a little closer anyway. This was when he simply broke eye contact, turned, stepped down into the wash at the shallow point where he was standing, and walked away down the wash without looking back. Within a couple of steps, he disappeared around a slight curve in the wall of the wash as it cut through the next finger of the ridge. We had stood looking at each other for maybe 45 seconds. I didn't move for a couple of seconds after he disappeared, waiting to give him time to go before moving to check on David. I've never seen anybody so afraid that they were frozen on the spot before, and I was concerned about him. As I walked up to David, looking cautiously down the walk as I got a better angle on it, my brother followed me and said in a voice that seemed to beg me to believe him,
"That wasn't a man."
Standing in front of David, I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, it was. It was just a big, tall hobo." That ended the discussion. I asked David if he was okay. He just shook his head yes and didn't say anything. My brother moved up to the edge of the wash to see as far down it as he could, and I asked if he could see the guy. He couldn't, and we started to leave when curiosity got the better of us, and my brother asked,
"What do you think he was doing down there?"
I thought about it for a second, and decided I wanted to know too. So we walked along the edge of the wash for 100 yards or so, to make sure he wasn't hiding close enough to threaten us. We walked back down to the shallow spot in the wash and jumped down into it. I briefly recognized that the man had simply stepped down the 3 feet I had just jumped, but didn't say anything. We walked both up and down the wash 100 feet or so looking for a campsite. We didn't find one. No fire pit, no food wrappers, no trash, no drug paraphernalia. No signs that a human had been camping there. The floor of the wash was granite sand, so there really weren't any footprints that I could recognize to indicate where he may have been. We did find a spot where someone had taken pieces of tumbleweed and sticker bush and embedded them in the wall of the wash. Tumbleweed and pieces of bush were also arranged on the floor of the wash at the same spot. Those embedded in the wall of the wash were arranged in a tall half oval with the peak about 4.5 feet high. Those on the floor of the wash were also arranged in a half oval that joined the first. It was about the right size for the guy to sit cross-legged in with his back against the wall of the wash. At that time, I hadn't even heard of Bigfoot. Even though several things about the encounter were strange, I convinced myself that we had been confronted by a man. What else could it have been? About 10 days later, though, something happened that forced me to admit that there was something in the valley that was man-like but wasn't a man.
I have previously described nearby Peavine Mountain and Limon Valley. Our house was located on the east side of the valley. It was in a new development at the time, tucked back in a draw among several steep hills. The surrounding hills rose from 50 to 250 feet above our neighborhood and were primarily granite outcroppings. The soil was a coarse granite sand interspersed with boulders of various sizes. Where there was vegetation on the hills, it was predominantly sagebrush. In the draws, the sand was less coarse and there were a variety of grasses and other weeds. We had just moved into the newly completed house a few weeks earlier and were getting to know our neighbors, all of whom had just moved into their new homes as well. Like many of our neighbors, we were building a fence and otherwise improving our property. At the time, there was only one thing to detract from this new neighborhood: the presence of a pack of feral dogs. The pack was composed of 4 large dogs, 2 Dobermans and a couple of mixed breeds. They were a matter of some concern because many of the new residents had small children and the pack displayed absolutely no trace of fear of people. They would generally appear around dusk when it began to cool and boldly range through the neighborhood. At night you could often hear them in the surrounding hills, barking and baying occasionally. It didn't take long to determine that they had no owner, and one of our neighbors, an animal control officer from the city of Reno, told us that he had arranged for the county to do something about them. Our home was an L-shaped ranch with 2 of 4 bedrooms in the back at the top of the L and a garage in front at the bottom right of the L, facing the street. We had partially constructed a cedar plank fence around the property, starting in back and working our way around the property clockwise. We had completed the fence on the side of the property at the top of the L and had built a small section of fence connecting the back left corner of the L to the fence on that side. This created a small cul-de-sac behind the house. Along the side of the property, to the right of the L, we had set the posts and rails. Along the front, where we intended to connect it to the garage, at the lower right corner of the L, we had set the posts but hadn't yet put the rails. You could, essentially, walk right into our backyard from the street side of the house, but could not leave the yard on the back side without climbing over the fence. On the night of the encounter, I had picked up all the 2x4s we hadn't used as rails yet, and I had stacked them horizontally along the base of the fence back in the cul-de-sac. This was a precaution since they were pilferable, and we weren't the only ones building a new fence. My bedroom was at the top right corner of the L. The ground outside my window was about 1.5 feet below the floor of my room. My mother had already planted a small flower bed of marigolds there. To protect it, she had me put in one of those small, white-painted wire trellises that reminded you of a bunch of coat hangers welded together. To put it in, I had to heavily wet down the ground, then force it in. Once the ground dried, the powdered granite and sand set like concrete. It was about 1 foot high. The incident occurred between midnight and 12:30 a.m. It was late summer, and I was awake late reading. I had my window open, but the drapes were closed. That night, the pack of feral dogs had been more noisy than usual. Every so often, their barking would become particularly strident, drawing my attention away from my book. I remember thinking to myself, over the course of 15 minutes or so, that they were chasing another jackrabbit, then deciding it must be a coyote since they'd been going at it for longer than usual, then wondering if they might have a cougar at bay since they were still barking and baying loudly, but it seemed stationary. I was just turning back to my book when I realized that they had started moving again and were coming down the street in the direction of the house. I started to sit up, intending to go to the living room window to see what they were chasing, but realized that they would be well past the house before I could get to the living room in front. As I listened, though, the noise of the pursuit didn't decrease the way I had expected it to as they chased their quarry past the opposite side of the house. Instead, it grew louder, and I realized whatever they were chasing into our backyard. I also realized that they might corner it behind the house in the cul-de-sac. Excited, I started to get up to look out the window. Before I could get up, though, their quarry rounded the back right corner of the garage, heading in the direction of my bedroom at the back right corner of the house. For just a second, I could clearly hear it running, as the sounds of the dogs were still partially masked around the corner of the garage. As it covered the 20 feet between the 2 corners, I heard 3 distinct, heavy footfalls. One just as it rounded the garage, one midway between the garage and the corner of the house, and the third just under my window, where the wire trellis was set firmly in the ground. This was followed by an incredible impact into the corner of the house. The force was so great that I could hear the 4x4 upright in the wall crack and the whole room shook. The impact and cracking sound came from a point about 5.5 feet above the level of the ground outside. Simultaneously, there was a second impact about 7 feet above ground level across the top right corner of my window as viewed from outside. The window rattled violently in the frame, and I was sure it was cracked. Immediately following the two simultaneous impacts, there was a forced grunt, as if the wind had been knocked out of whatever it was, and I could hear its body fall heavily to the ground. My first thought was, oh my god, they're chasing a man. The footfalls were clearly bipedal, the height of the impact was too high for it to be anything four-legged, and the sound of it having its wind knocked out was man-like, if somewhat heavy. Also, from the sound of its fall, it went from an erect to a prone position. At the same time, I recognized that something was strange. The man hadn't called for help, hadn't made any vocal noises at all, in fact. He had covered 20 feet in what was essentially 2 strides and had hit the house at a point too high for all but the largest of men. The secondary impact across the outside corner of the window was also too high for most people to reach, and the force of the impact, strong enough to make the 4x4 in the house's frame crack, indicated much more mass than any normal person would have. I didn't spend any time really thinking about this though, even though I had an underlying uneasiness because the sounds indicated that the guy was huge. I was sure the dogs were chasing a man. The dogs closed on the man, snarling and barking. I was afraid he was lying on the ground, injured or unconscious, and I realized that I had to do something. I immediately threw my sheet off, jumped out of the bed, and reached for the drapes, intending to throw them open and yell at the dogs. About all I could do in that situation. In the 2 or 3 seconds it took to do this, though, it didn't sound like the dogs were mauling the man. They were about 3 feet from the house, stationary, barking, and growling. It sounded as if there were only 3 of them, 2 very aggressive and ready to attack, and one that was barking the way a dog would if it were afraid of you, but ready to attack if provoked. Just as my fingertips touched the drapes, the scariest thing I've ever experienced in my life happened. Somehow, the man had recovered from hitting the house, having the wind knocked out of him, and falling. He had somehow managed to stand up and get his breath back, and just as I touched the drapes, from a point immediately outside my window, level with and about 2 feet from my head, he growled back at the dogs. The growl wasn't loud, it was only about 2.5 seconds long, but it was the meanest, deepest, and most menacing growl I have ever heard in my life, including those of trapped brown bears at Yellowstone. It was almost as if he was keenly aware that there were people around, that he knew precisely how long he had to growl to get his point across, and that he didn't want to make any more noise than he absolutely had to. For the next several seconds there was absolute silence. He didn't make any more noise. The dogs didn't even make any sounds of movement, and I was frozen in fear and shock, praying that he wouldn't notice I was there and afraid he would hear me if I moved at all. It was like that for several long seconds. Then, all but silently, I heard him step and brush around the corner of the house. A second later, the dogs were after him, but the head start was all he needed. I heard the stack of 2x4s tumble down and the sound of him hitting the 6-foot cedar fence as he went over it, followed by the dogs hitting the fence and then scratching at it and barking. After a few moments, the dogs stopped trying to get over the fence and raced back around the house clockwise. As I heard the dogs racing down the street, I relaxed slightly and gulped for breath. I hadn't even realized I'd been holding it. I immediately choked. The thing had left an incredible stench. It was overpowering. It smelled like a combination of wet dog, stale urine, and rancid sweat. There was also an acrid component, a little like burnt rubber. It was so bad that I staggered away from the window. I stood there for a few moments trying to decide what to do. The thing was gone, the dogs were gone, and all I would accomplish by waking my parents would be to anger my father. I decided it wasn't worth it. I thought about going outside but really didn't want to poke around out there in the dark. I was struggling with what I had just experienced. Whatever had been outside my window was man-like, but clearly not a man. I had no frame of reference to place it in. I didn't relate the experience to my encounter at the dry wash because I had so thoroughly convinced myself that that had been a man. I closed my window, which to my amazement was not broken, got back in bed, and tried to read to get my mind off of the incident. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke after my father had left for work. I looked out my window and could see the flower bed, trellis and all, had been flattened. I got dressed and went outside. The ground was scuffed, but there were no distinctive footprints. I choked down my apprehension and walked back into the fenced cul-de-sac behind the house. The stack of 2x4s was lying there toppled. I looked at the cedar fence. The scratch marks from the dog's nails were clear. Cut on the top of one of the planks was a tuft of coarse hair. I stepped up to the lower rail of the fence and looked at it closely in the bright morning sunlight. It was dark black with hints of brownish-red highlights and about 3 inches long. It had enough oil on it to make it shine if you looked at it closely. I struggled with whether it had come from the thing or from one of the dogs. After several moments of consideration, I decided it was possible one of the Dobermans could have had some 3-inch strands of hair, that the colors were within the appropriate range, and that one of the dogs might actually have managed to make it over the fence to leave it there. I left it where it was. I went back to the window and examined it and the siding on the corner of the house closely. I didn't see any damage from the impacts. I decided that this thing had been running, hadn't seen the trellis, and had tried to cut around the corner of the house too closely. The trellis, strongly embedded in the cement-like soil, tripped it and it fell, throwing its left arm up in an attempt to maintain balance or maybe grab the roof to catch itself. The primary impact would have been from its body. The secondary impact could have been from the left arm slapping the side of the house across the corner of the window. I went in and told my mother about the incident. I was still very troubled and wanted to know what I had heard. I discussed it at length with my father when he got home. He was uncharacteristically patient and explained that it had either been a bear or a cougar. I couldn't accept either of those explanations. It wasn't until about a year later that I ran across a tourist pamphlet in Oregon that was about Bigfoot. I can't express how relieved I was at the time to learn that there was a potential explanation for what I had experienced. We never saw or heard from the dogs again after that night. Alright, everyone, thanks for listening. These reports came from the BFRO website, that is the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. Same people that would be on Finding Bigfoot back on Animal Planet, or was it Animal Planet? Okay, it is Animal Planet. So Tang, any thoughts on those?
This guy yaps a lot. A lot. One thing I noticed is that he seems to have a weird infatuation with the environment.
You're just kind of describing it.
I mean, am I wrong though? It's kind of weird.
Okay, I think I will admit it's very long, his talk about the environment, but I feel like it helps set the story. In the second story, right?
Yeah.
Its second encounter, he talks about the washes, and he goes into great detail about how there's all this wildlife around, right? Mm-hmm. Even though it's a really dry area. So it's saying, oh, maybe there's possibly, it could be there a Bigfoot living there. All these other big animals are living here.
Yeah.
And with the washes, he puts those, he describes those so much because it's important to the story, because he just drops into one easily when he was hiding in it earlier, mm-hmm. and the kids needed to, jump into it. It was 3 feet tall.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of using the environment to kind of tell the story, but I think the way he did it was really convoluted. Yeah, that's my main complaint with the story I narrated per se.
What did you think of the first one? I think it kind of set the theme. Was ooh, something might be around here.
It was a really good introduction, in my opinion.
Okay.
I think it did do a really good job at setting the stage of oh, who is this creature? It's this big, tall man, presumably.
Oh no, the first one's actually the one I narrated at first, the one with the calling. We were just hearing what sounded like a siren, yelling from the bottom of the mountain.
It was purely volume, right?
Yeah, I personally think that's a good inclusion here, because it's okay, one time I heard something in there, and then the next one we get to hear about him seeing the thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool, though. If you think about it in hindsight, it relies on, senses. So, the first one was, hearing it. The second one was, seeing him in person. It kind of, It activates your fight or flight response in like 2 different ways. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the first one, he's a few years younger. I think he's only like 9 or 10 in the first one. So like he's just asking his dad, "What's that?"
Yeah. It kind of like preys on that idea of like you seeing things like as a child, but like your parents are not going to believe you because you're just a child. You have like a crazy imagination.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's like that horror scenario.
What do you think of the payoff of like it all built up to that this man encountered what he thinks is a Bigfoot anyway?
Yeah.
Like crashing literally into his bedroom wall.
Freaking house breaking, bro. I did not expect that at all. I thought he would mostly just be lurking in the shadows like he was like in the first 2 stories.
You never hear like, okay, I personally, right, I am a big fan of Bigfoot. I got like 4 different shirts of him. And
Valid,
like,
valid.
okay, I'll put this out here. I don't necessarily believe he's real. I just think it's really cool if he would be real, you know? But I follow this YouTuber, his name's Bob Gimlin, and he does all these like in-depth analysis of Bigfoot encounters.
Right.
I think it's like viewer submitted ones, but like he does it all type of cryptid stuff like that.
Yeah.
But so I've listened to like all of his videos, and I've listened to other encounter stuff, and you never hear of like Bigfoot being chased by something. So
yeah.
when I was reading this, I was like, oh man, this is kind of a neat story.
Yeah. It's a very you already said unique story.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, just to recite what you said, yeah. I feel like having him, like, be the person to, like, break into his house definitely made this story stand out a lot more than your average story. Because a lot of stories with, like, these quote-unquote monsters, mostly just have them lurking in the shadows, just, like, kind of teasing their prey but never actually, like, trying to, like, inflict harm onto them.
Yeah, and it's like this one, he's like, it's here.
Yeah, he's here, and he's an op, bro.
Well, Tang, this is a allegedly true story submitted to the Bigfoot Field Research Organization database. Do you believe that this has any truth to it?
No. I think a lot of it was dramatized just for the sake of telling a cool story, essentially.
I mean, he definitely spent a long time writing it of how detailed it was.
Yeah,
and
100%.
But I think it's like to a believable extent. Like if this is just someone who, as a kid, encountered like this big man, and later had another huge thing crash into his house. You know, maybe he wants to submit it here. Maybe he genuinely believes it's a Bigfoot. If that happened to you, would you kind of start believing in Bigfoot?
Yeah, low-key, I probably would turn into, like, one of those crazy, like, online conspiracy theorists.
It's like, if you encounter one of these things, suddenly your whole
worldview just switches.
Yeah, exactly. Personally, I like to, anything that's submitted under the guise of being a true story, like this one, I try to have benefit of the doubt and believe them. And if that's the case right now, I think that's kind of a really neat encounter. And I think it's another example of stories of just like something unexplainable, not necessarily Bigfoot. This one in the case, it's like he definitely thinks it's Bigfoot.
Yeah,
but I really like stories where it's like everything about it kind of lines up of like, okay, I can believe this happened, but there's no explanation as to how it happened.
Right.
And that's kind of what makes a good horror story, in my opinion.
Yeah. Give it like that ambiguity. Yeah, that definitely adds to it a lot. 100%.
All right. Any closing thoughts, Tang?
Very interesting stories. I don't think I've heard like any stories that are similar to these. I have heard Bigfoot horror stories online, but they're a lot more low key. It's just him like, it's just people thinking they're seeing him when in reality it's probably not him. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I was going on the database looking about the recent encounters. Some of them, like, they do have some interaction with, like, the Bigfoot.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are just like, I think I kind of saw it. And so this one, I found it because they actually sort it by state, and I saw that Nevada had only, like, 7 or something.
Really?
Yeah, it had less than any other one, I think.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, hey, well, I wonder what any of these encounters are. And I immediately stumbled into this.
Dang, bro.
So, hey, they might not have as many encounters, but like on the database, but damn, they had detailed ones.
Hell yeah, man.
All right.
That's what's up.
Anything else?
No, that's it.
All right. Guys, thank you for listening.